Hi, I'm Philip Hundle. I'm an attorney here in Texas along the Gulf Coast. I handle uh, representing landowners in uh, condemnation cases that could be power lines, pipelines, gas pipelines, crude pipelines, other type of petroleum products passing through pipelines, uh, expansions of highways, roadways, or even canals. We've had canal work uh, against LCRA and different water authorities. Uh, what I'd like to talk today about is this is one of the questions that I probably get asked um, half a dozen times a day. Different calls from different folks asking what's the going rate for a pipeline easement. So what's the going rate for a pipeline easement? How much can I expect? Um, so and unfortunately, I have to give them an answer, and I always say, sorry, but I'm going to have to give you an answer, like most lawyers would probably give you. Is it depends, and it depends on a lot of factors. And so I kind of go through the different factors, and I actually ask them the questions of, and you'll hear these factors in a minute, but I'll ask these questions and to get the answers from from the landowner, and the landowner won't have the answers. And so therefore, like I tell them, at this point, it's impossible to determine what that going rate for that easement could or should or might be, because we don't have the answers to these questions. And so one of the first, I'm going to run through these factors. So there's quite a few factors in determining or trying to assess, the offer, what a counter offer should be. And so the first question is this, and we're going to focus today, right, just on pipeline easements or pipeline companies that are seeking an easement on your property. You're the landowner. So the first question is this going to be a private arrangement, or is this going to be a taking for a public use? So that's the number one question to ask: is this pipeline company trying to acquire this easement by just an agreement between the landowner? And we often times call that it's a private line, or it's a private transaction, because if they cannot reach an agreement with the landowner, then they'll go around that particular track, or decide not to run the line, or something to that effect. So, so first is if it's private or public. If it's public, the pipeline company or the condemnor, the pipeline company, is going to condemn your property and take it through using their power of eminent domain that they may or may not have, and that's something to be determined in the case, but through the process of condemnation. So eminent domain is the power that government, or in some cases a private entity, can have to take property from a private individual or private entity or private company or whatever. So if the company is going to be using eminent domain and go through the condemnation process, so that's extremely important, and that is going to play into what the quote unquote going rate will be, or not so much going rate, but the amount that they may agree to pay if a settlement is reached, or that a judge or jury could determine in coming up with just compensation. So also, it may be a company that claims to have the right of eminent domain, but they're not planning on using that. And so even though they may say, well, we're a common carrier, we could condemn your property, they're choosing for this particular project to not condemn your property. So they're going to, go through I'm going to say, take the path of a private acquisition of the easement. Next big question is, what's going to be the scope of the easement? What are going to be the terms of the easement, or the easement that they need, or the easement that they're seeking? Lots of different factors come into play. We can talk about what's going to be at least what they're asking for, or seeking, or planning to take from you if you cannot reach an agreement. Is what's the width of the permanent easement? What's the width of the temporary easements? how many, how much additional workspace are they going to need. Very important components to determining or assessing compensation, right? And so if it's really wide easement, stands to reason that they should pay more. If it's a very narrow one, also the size of the pipe. Uh, an 8-inch pipe probably doesn't have the same effect on your property as a 42-inch line. So size of the pipe is really important. Also, the number of pipes or number of pipelines that can be put in that easement agreement. Normally, and sometimes landowners will just take it for granted that, well, it's only going to be an easement for one pipe. But if it's not specified, or potentially if the easement agreement states multiple pipes can be put in within this easement, this width of this permanent easement area, then it could be more than just one. So that's a key term that you need to know. Number of pipes, size of pipe, and then also lots of important factors, but another big one is above ground facilities. What above ground things, and even below ground, but what other things besides just this pipe in the ground is this pipeline company wanting to do on your property? So they could have quite a few below ground facilities, but also above ground facilities. Now, something above ground, in my opinion, has a tremendous effect on your property, the property that's within the easement area, within the permanent easement area, but then also a great effect on the remainder of your property, and therefore has a damage to the, a large damage to the remainder, these above ground facilities. So above ground facilities will oftentimes be called above ground appurtenances. So above ground appurtenances, above ground facilities, those could be, different types of valves, compressor stations, other above ground appurtenances or facilities, pipeline markers. Sure, and there's pipeline markers almost always at a boundary line, crossing of a road, crossing of another pipeline, cathodic protection test leads, and cathodic protection equipment. On the blog, you can look at some of the photos I have of those different items. So above ground facilities, extremely important. Also, access roads. Is this pipeline company, is the condemner going to take from you, if you don't agree, a temporary access road, right, or a right to have a access road, be it temporary access or permanent access? And so, temporary access road would only, last as long as the construction, their initial construction is taking place. Normally, let's just say 18 months to 2 years, or it could be less. Permanent access road, obviously permanent. What material will be passing through the pipe? That also is extremely important. The pressure, level of pressure that material will be passing through the pipeline. Also, I've seen in lots of different cases that the different pipeline companies tend to have sometimes different philosophies or policies on compensation. So, and timing of compensation. And as crazy as it may sound, the same pipeline company will have different policies and strategies, or company policies on different pipeline projects. So just because it's a Kinder Morgan or it's an enterprise, they don't always do what they did on the last project. I've heard anywhere from, well, the budget's different, to, I guess, different managers or directors or personnel on that particular project. Who knows? But not all projects of the same company are treated the same financially, or at least financially to compensation to the landowners. And then also multiple factors. I'm just giving you the kind of the top, I guess maybe top 10 or so factors. Also, are there other options for routes for the pipeline company? If there are other options of routing, maybe routing around your track, then that also will play into compensation. How and why? Well, what if think of it almost as a bottleneck. And let's just say that there's protected land on each side, either due to wetlands, other factors, or endangered species, environment, or habitat. And your tract is, let's just say, the only track for, you know, miles, and there's no other route that they can quote unquote take. And so obviously, they will probably have an incentive to possibly pay you more. Now, there always comes a moment where, or a economic point where the pipeline company will say, we're not willing to pay that much. We're willing to obviously go to trial and let a judge or jury determine just compensation to the landowner. So hopefully that helps answer the question of what's the going rate on a pipeline easement. Lots of factors come into play. It's an apples and oranges comparison. I always try to, stress to landowners that your neighbor may have agreed to X amount for the pipeline easement, but his pipeline easement agreement may allow for many, many, many things that your pipeline easement doesn't, or your pipeline easement agreement requires the pipeline company to do a lot of other things in addition that are non-monetary compensation, but obviously, needless to say, benefit the landowner. So once again, it's an apples to oranges comparison, and so be careful when you want to try to make those comparisons. Hopefully that's helpful. It's a question that I get asked every day, so hopefully that can help provide some guidance to you all out there. Thanks.